Welcome, Scotty. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much for the invitation. Thank you all for coming.
One of the things that I always find interesting in these conversations, and I never let them usually know what I'm going to ask or prepare for.
That's right. He would not give me the slightest idea of what was going to happen here.
But you grew up in the Northeast, as I understand, from a family of privilege, and then went on to Yale, and in fact, your thesis was on computers and infinity, right?
Correct.
Just that in and of itself, I find sort of, and this was though in the 60s,
the
right?
60s.
Yeah. So
computers were very big and in air-controlled rooms, and it was a little different.
And how did that actually connect with infinity? I am going someplace with this. So.
Well, I had a theory that computers, the logical design of computers, couldn't deal with infinity, that they're finite machines, and that we humans access infinity in a variety of ways, possibly in our language and our symbolic systems, and ultimately with our religion. So I was trying to struggle with how, as we begin to merge with computers, which I assumed would happen a lot sooner than it apparently has, we'd become inside them or they're inside us, what would happen to infinity?
Did consciousness have any impact on that thought process?
Yeah, because a lot of it was looking at mind. What is the mind? Is a computer a model of mind, or is it something quite different? And indeed, what is consciousness? It seems to have to do with self-referentiality. We're able to get outside of ourselves and then look back at ourselves. And a lot of the problems with logical designs, logical systems, formal logical systems, is they can get into self-referential paradoxes. Bertrand Russell did a lot of work with this, but Alan Turing, the Turing machine, one of the concepts for computers, had a halting problem where he said that computers with certain problems that are self-referential can get into these infinite loops and never solve the problem or stop. Kurt Gödel, in philosophy, said that if you have a formal logical system, it'll never be complete with regards to mathematics. So you can never formally ground mathematics in logic. But if you try to do it, it will become inconsistent. So you can't get completeness and consistency became just a fascinating concept to me. And my professor of philosophy and mathematics at Yale said, I get around this by allowing infinite proofs. Really? What is that? And he said, well, you just build the whole body of the integers in and you have an infinite proof, an infinite set, and that involves, that gets around these self-referential paradoxes. Now, somewhere this has something to do with consciousness, but I'm sure we're probably beginning to bore our audience. So
No.
We could go. And by the way, I didn't grow up on the East Coast. I did go to college on the East Coast. I went to a prep school on the East Coast.
Hotchkiss.
But the Hotchkiss School. Yeah. But I grew up
in Illinois.
In Illinois,
Right,
in a suburb north of Chicago, Lake Forest, Illinois, which was a childhood of privilege. I grew up in a business family, a lot of wealth and privilege, and therefore, perhaps germane to the subject tonight, I began to identify with the story of the Buddha because here's somebody who grew up as a prince and began to look around and see that the world was not exactly as he thought from his castle. So that's what happened to me in high school.
And at some point, though, you did, in fact, go to India.
I did go to India after my freshman year in college.
And you got involved in meditation and Hindu philosophy as well as Buddhist philosophy, or?
Yep. I lived with a Hindu priest, and he was a Gandhian. And by that time I was starting to get involved in civil rights movement, anti-war movement. It was the 60s, and my mind, as somebody who came from a conservative Republican business family and a conservative Protestant evangelical background, which I'd rejected by this time. As I say, from my high school, Buddha finally leaves the castle and goes out to see what the world's really like. But yeah, this was a important time for me to live with a Hindu priest and to see what Gandhian philosophy was all about, how India had been liberated from the British, to learn meditation, to learn the incredible variety of religious experience in India, and to see the philosophy, which was one of, although there's a caste system, which was quite problematic, and in fact, other members of his family weren't happy that I was in the home because I wasn't a Brahmin from that perspective. But the openness of Indian religion, of Hinduism in particular, to other religions of the world. He knew the Bible better than I did. He knew the Quran. He knew the Buddhist scriptures. He knew Hindu scriptures, and had this very synthetic mind, and talked about many roads up the spiritual mountain. And you need to get on a road, he said, otherwise you start bushwhacking and going around in circles, and it doesn't get you very far. But he easily moved between traditions and between ways of understanding the world. So it was a very formative time for me.
Was your family supportive of this?
No. This is the 60s, so we didn't... families, parents, and kids were, by that time, rather alienated. So a lot of us. I don't mean to say everyone. But no, my family was not pleased about my trajectory at that point in terms of, as I say, I was a conservative Republican. By this time, I'm sort of moved through being a Democrat to being, a radical beyond that, in my mind anyway, and involved in civil rights and anti-war activities, and I'd become a self-confessed atheist in high school, along with other things that were happening to me. And India was not a place they thought would make a lot of sense for me to be going.
So you went on to Yale. Now, prior to going to Yale, and you were already, if you will, on this trajectory, was there a particular individual or a mentor that had already begun to have an impact, or was just your own self-exploration that sort of led you to begin looking at the world this different way?
Well, probably the most formative experience for me was after my junior year in high school, going on a program called the Experiment in International Living, which was founded in the 1930s, and which actually was a precursor to the Peace Corps. There were the Sergeant Shriver, who was the founder of the first executive of the Peace Corps, had been very involved in this program, the Experiment in International Living. And I went to Holland, which seemed benign enough, I suppose. For my parents, that was nice, go to Europe. But I lived with a fairly poor family in northern Holland that I spent most of the summer digging potatoes and getting to know a very different life there. And when I came back to the Hotchkiss School, a boarding school, and so my eyes were open, saw the way employees who worked in the dining room, on the grounds, custodians, et cetera, the way they were treated, I just found it appalling. And I said, why have I not seen this before? Why have I not realized basically class differences and the way human beings are not compassionate to each other based on class difference?
And then, of course, you went on to Yale, and I think certainly, at least as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but one of your pivotal interactions was with William Sloane Coffin.
Right. So the university chaplain, William Sloane Coffin, was very involved in the civil rights movement, anti-war movement, and so on. And when I first entered Yale, he had what he called a seminar for friendly disbelievers. And it was a non-credit seminar, but it was, I was certainly a disbeliever, but I thought I was still fairly friendly. I was interested in religion and so on. But he also was very involved, as I say, as an activist. And I was listening up to a very different vision of Christianity, one with Jesus as the compassionate activist who was out there with the poor and with people who were being discriminated against in ancient Israel and so on. And it was he definitely had a huge impact on my life, and other people around him, other chaplains at Yale and Divinity students at Yale, the kind of work that they were doing was very impressive to me. And so I was drawn to religion again with new eyes.
It's sort of interesting that you mentioned that, because we look at, if you will, the fundamentalist or in some ways the evangelical movement in the United States, and it seems as though identifying with the poor and, if you will, living Jesus's message of love and if you will, caring for the meekest. In fact, it's stay away from us. We're about ideology, and we're not necessarily about serving the poor unless it's those who completely agree with our agenda. And I'm not trying to turn this into but
well, you know, the interesting thing about that is when I was at Yale, evangelical Christians and the public face of religion in the 1960s, Martin Luther King Jr., Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta with the farm workers movement here, Rosa Parks, the William Sloane Coffin, anti-war activists, civil rights activists, labor activists. This was how religion was seen in the public sphere. And evangelical Christians at Yale and nationally said, religion should have no role in politics, should have no role in public life. It's a relationship between you and God and your own salvation. And in fact, it's sacrilegious and anti-Christian to be engaged in using this for, public justice, being out in the public arena. Maybe if you want to do private charity and so on, that's fine. So that all got flipped, you may have noticed, in the last 30 or 40 years, starting with Jerry Falwell and the Moral Majority in the late 70s, and then Pat Robertson and so on, who began to pick up some of those techniques of saying, of course religion should be involved in public life. And before we knew it, the public face of Christianity in America was so-called pro-life, anti-LGBT folk and same-gender marriage, contraception, issues around contraception, issues around evolution, and so on. So we had a very different picture. I do want to say, though, that now, ironically, I think evangelical Christians, in many cases, are doing a better job than liberals in social justice work. They're the ones that are often down in Mexico, Central America, South America, over in Africa, engaging with the poor directly. They may come with a message. There may be, ultimately some concern, as you say, about ideology and so on. But I'm a little bit ashamed of us liberals who don't seem to be out there as much. We may be doing some meditation and some navel gazing and some, but we're not out there as much as we should be.
No, I think that's certainly an interesting point. I think it's also interesting because on the one hand, we look at Western Europe and we see this progress towards secularism. But interestingly, the religions that still are maintained all still, though, focus on the poor and service to the poor, which is sort of an interesting paradox as they're sort of becoming more godless. There are religious organizations, though, still remain focused on social justice, poverty, service.
Look at the Pope. Yeah. Now, this Pope, that is his fundamental emphasis, and bringing us back to understanding a preferential option for the poor that used to be the vision of liberation theology of the Catholic Church coming out of Vatican II in the 60s. So, yeah, this is a very interesting time to see what's happening in Catholicism, for example.
Well, it'll be interesting to see how far this goes in the context of the boundaries around Catholic ideology, of course, as well. But no, I don't think anybody can question his sincerity and active demonstration of, I think, all of our obligation of service to those less fortunate and keeping it on the sort of the front burner. And speaking of that, then, so ultimately, you went on to Harvard Divinity School and to the law school. Actually, and you probably know this better than I didn't realize this. Do you know Xavier Girard Hermé? So he's the scion of the Hermès family. He has an MBA from Harvard, but I was with him and it turns out he has an MA from Harvard Divinity School, which I found sort of fascinating, and has been involved in the peace movement, which I did not know at the time. But so following this, you made a decision to go and practice, if you will, poverty law. And what can you tell us about, as a personal note, in terms of that experience and how it also continued to support this sort of idea of seeing the world differently?
Yeah. So when I was in college and with William Sloane Coffin and doing the kinds of things that I was describing that the 60s were stimulating for a number of us, I'd always planned to be a lawyer. That was because my parents said, you're so obnoxious, argue all the time, and so you should be a lawyer. So okay, I should be a lawyer. But in college, I found I was getting more engaged in these things regarding religion, India, liberal Christianity, and so on. And I began to say I might need to go to divinity school to explore this a little bit more, but I still want to go to law school. And I began to see the law as a tool for social justice. So why couldn't I take the law and do a ministry in a social justice ministry, a community ministry? I never thought I was going to be in a church or be a preacher, that sort of thing. I wasn't interested in that much growing up, and although I had to go to church, but that's the reason I wasn't interested after a while. So the idea of coming out of divinity school and law school and being able to do a ministry in a low-income neighborhood where I could use the law as a tool, I, with several other people, began to conceive of what we call legal ministry or ministry at law in a low-income community. So ultimately, I started working for Greater Boston Legal Services, which was a legal aid office, federally funded, but also local charitable funding as well. But then was able to set up a program and a storefront in a neighborhood called The Legal Ministry, where we tried to see our clients' legal problems in relation to their whole life situation, because often attorneys try to, almost like surgeons, narrow down on what we really have to get out, under the issue, and not see how it's contextualized in people's lives. So the idea was for us, when somebody walked through the door of the legal ministry, to deal with the presenting legal problem, but try to see what else is going on in your life. Can we help you maximize your income, whether that's through work programs or welfare, or people who are often disabled or elderly and so on, other kinds of programs. Can we deal with your immigration issues, your family issues, and see it as a whole? And every so often, people would say, ministry, legal ministry, what's that? Will you pray with me? Will you help me? Because how could a just and loving God be doing all these horrible things to me? I don't deserve this. I'm trying to be a good person. So it had that dimension as well. So yeah, I ended up for 10 years doing a legal ministry in the Dorchester section of Boston.
Wow. Well, I'm still struggling with that question. How does a loving God do these things? But we can continue that a little. We'll solve that problem near the end of our...
That's an important issue. That's what drove me away from Christianity in the first place, was to say, and that's what drove me to be an atheist. I mean, either it's got to be a pretty horrible God and not just... What people do to people is one thing, so a lot of that can be explained that way. But the so-called, as I learned in law school, acts of God, hurricanes, tornadoes, tsunamis, things that happen to people, birth defects, all these things those are acts of God. So either we have a horrendous God, or there can't be a God. We just got it wrong.
Or
so I chose.
He's visiting some other multiverse, perhaps, or something.
Or the deist God, sort of set things up, and
he went to
natural
the next
law,
row.
and then stepped away.
Yeah, no, and I think Bart, is it Ehrman? Have you read his work? Yeah, I mean that. Here's a very religious individual who has spent a great part of his life being quite religious, who struggled with this question of suffering and could not come to grips with it. And
this is a scholar of New Testament, eminent scholar of New Testament, who now identifies as an atheist, but continues to be a great scholar of the New Testament.
Yes. Well, it's interesting that you gave the surgical analogy, and I think you're right in some ways. And in fact, I think that's one of the problems of medicine.
Everyone knows this is an eminent neurosurgeon, I hope. That's where he spends most of his time, is inside your brain.
Compassion is my hobby. Neurosurgery is my profession. Or actually, maybe it's getting reversed nowadays. I don't know. But it is sort of interesting because oftentimes physicians, unfortunately, frankly, are focused on the problem. But as Scotty was saying in his own legal ministry, while there may be the problem, it's actually the person that you're there to serve. And until you can reorient how you think to see how, number one, that problem impacts the whole person, or in fact the person has impacted that particular situation, you cannot be, I don't believe, the best physician you can be. And I think this is one of the problems with medicine and the way our construct is to take a little side path here. I tell people that while science and technology offer great benefit and have saved innumerable lives, it's truly the art of medicine that I believe, even in my own specialty, which is highly technology-driven, is as important or more important than these tools of science and technology. And that occurs when you actually take the whole person, their life situation, who they are, what is happening to them, into account as you interact with them. And I think that, like your own work, really is what brings you to the highest level of your own connection to the other, myself. That was just my own little preaching here. And then you left that, though.
Yeah, why did I leave that? You see the woman in the back row? That's my wife, Ellen, and she put an ad on the breakfast table one morning for the position of the university chaplain at Tufts. And I said, why would I do that? I'm a lawyer, in Boston, and love what I'm doing, and so on. She said, well, you do, but there's a lot of other things you've loved in your life. You love the academic life. You have students that are working in your office, law students, divinity students that you love working with. You might be able to scale this so that you could work with the volunteer organization, student organization at Tufts, and get a lot more people involved in inner city ministry than you are in your little storefront operation here. And you be within a community where things like preaching and pastoral counseling and so on can be done in a context rather sort of in the middle of the city and so on. So why don't you just go check it out, and see? So I went and checked it out, and long story short, I sort of fell in love with the idea of chaplaincy in a university, and did end up being the advisor to the student volunteer organization at Tufts. And I was there for 16 years in a different career.
And did you ever regret or sort of think back, or sort of did you feel like you were withdrawing from something that had great meaning and you were having to sacrifice to do that? Or was it, this was just a different, if you will, a part of the same picture, just a different way of, if you will, doing your ministry?
Well, I'd like to say it was the second. It's just another way of doing ministry, and I don't regret a thing, and it was I did regret it in many ways, because I said I was dealing with people who were dealing with life and death issues. I mean, somebody whose heat had been shut off by a landlord, a slumlord in the winter, and their kid was dying of pneumonia, people who were being sent back to countries where they would be killed when they returned, dealing with real, issues of wealth and poverty. Now I'm in a fairly privileged environment of a New England college, university, with a lot of middle and upper income students who'd come from backgrounds like mine, but obviously a lot of low-income students as well. So I had to sort of work on that for a while to say, can I justify that? And now I'm at Stanford, where I've been for 14 years. Look at how beautiful it is here. So I spend some time saying to myself, is this the right life trajectory? And is it just hypocrisy to claim to be a compassionate Christian and be telling other people how to act, preaching from pulpits, when I'm not necessarily practicing what I'm preaching anymore? Yeah.
And how have you reconciled that?
I have not reconciled that.
Well,
How I reconcile it is I say, we do our best day to day. You try to, I'm not a saint, and you try to incrementally take these issues seriously, but there's a lot of good that can be done at a university and helping people to think about the kinds of things that you and I do in terms of compassion, and there may be some real impact from that. And I can do a lot to help students when they're here. So, yeah, I work on that. But I think I think probably all of us should have that kind of edge where we're always saying, wait a minute, are you really doing the work that needs to be done? Are you really with the people you need to be with? And as you and I were talking out there, earlier, you were in Cambodia and you were, last week, and you're saying, gee, look at the level of poverty and injustice here. And now you're going to come back and sit up here with me in this beautiful place. And
no, and I don't say those things to put you on the spot, because obviously this is a reflection I myself have had. And, just being here today, we're better off than 99.9% of the people in the world. And, what is our responsibility? And I'm certainly not the arbiter of that, but I think, as you were just saying, at least having those self-conversations, it at least in some ways keeps you honest and maybe gives you some insight into each of our own delusions about why we do what we do, and sort of makes us look at things sometimes differently. Certainly, and I maybe can address this, we here at Stanford have the opportunity to interact with some of the brightest young minds in the world, and hopefully, perhaps by example or education or interaction, our own actions, we can inspire or give some insights to some of these kids that make them understand the value of service and the wonderful gift that serving others and caring for others brings to you as a human being. We were talking about meditation a little bit, and one of the things that meditation allows you to do is, in some ways, gain some insights and sort of stop this ruminating that we have a tendency to do as humans. But that, I don't think, answers the ultimate question for many of us, which is, it's not so much what we're doing as to what ultimately that doing results in. Because I think at the end of the day, whether you believe in God or not, I think most of us would like to believe that we had a purpose here, and it's finding something that gives meaning and purpose, so that at the end of the day, you can say, yes, I'm glad I was here and I contributed.
I loved when the Dalai Lama was here, that you and I were involved you've much more involved over the years than I, but I'm thinking back to 2010, I guess, when he was here in 2005, but in 2010, when he got some questions about altruism, and sort of challenged by some questioners about pure altruism. They're saying, you're talking about happiness always as something that will help the individual, and you're saying, that compassion has something to do with happiness, but wait a minute, that's very egotistical, that's very selfish to talk about happiness and then somehow connect that to altruism. That's not pure altruism. And he said, you're missing the point here, which is that it's all interconnected. In the Christian tradition, they say, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. So if you want to call that a selfish dimension, as you'd have them do unto you, how you would like to be treated. But he said, we can show you now scientifically through the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education at the Stanford Medical School, but in other ways we can show you that, yes, the way you can become happiest, just start with your own happiness. Don't go any further than that. Start with your own happiness. The way you can be happiest is through compassion and altruism. And they're ultimately interconnected. So it's a false dichotomy to talk about altruism on the one hand and selfishness on the other, or to talk about pure altruism. It's interconnected. If you really want to be happy, then be truly compassionate.
You know, it's interesting because I've had a few conversations about this with him, and you know, he says that's one of the examples of where it's okay to be extraordinarily selfish, because by serving others, it actually greatly benefits yourself. And you know, there's just an amazing, ever-increasing amount of data that shows by serving others, it actually has a profound impact on your own health and well-being. In fact, there's a study of women over the age of 65, if I recall correctly, doing service with a minimum amount of hours per week or something. And that group of women had up to a 2x increase in longevity compared to those who did not. And with two exceptions in the self-report study, and the exceptions were when they did it to impress somebody, or they did it for a reward. So it really, even within your own physiology and mental state, it has to be done in some ways in a selfless way, without the primary motivation being for sort of self-aggrandizement or some other external purpose that feeds your ego. So it's a very interesting thing about how that works. You know, of course, you are a Unitarian Universalist. I'm still trying to understand Unitarian Universalist, because as I understand it, there is no creed per se.
No dogma, no doctrine, free religious tradition. We have people who say they're atheist, Unitarian Universalists, humanist, Hindu, Buddhist, Jewish, Christian. It's a wide open tradition. It did develop out of Christianity historically. There's some Reformation churches you'll find in Europe early in the Reformation, so back to 1500s, 1600s, that have the word Unitarian on them. And Unitarian was a slur because it was supposedly not Trinitarian for Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And Universalist, another tradition that developed and the two churches merged in 1961 in the US, they believed in universal salvation, that a just and loving God couldn't condemn people eternally to the fires of hell. So they were slurred as universal salvationists, Universalists. But by the time of Ralph Waldo Emerson, 1838, Harvard Divinity School address, for which he was kicked out of all churches in Boston, including Unitarian churches at the time, had to form the Transcendentalist movement.
I was going to say,
he went out to Concord, Massachusetts, and started the Transcendentalist movement with other people like Margaret Fuller. But anyway, he said, don't just look to the Christian scriptures, look to Buddhist and Hindu and other traditions, and look to nature. You can just go out and walk in nature. And he challenged ministers back there in 1838 to open up and not be so dogmatic and doctrinal. But I became a Unitarian Universalist because I wanted to be a Hindu.
This is a backdoor way.
Yeah. So what happened was, when I was in India with this Hindu priest, at the end of the summer, I said, this is it. Hinduism makes so much sense. How do I become a Hindu? And he said, you missed the whole point of everything I've been telling you. There are many roads up the spiritual mountain. There's different incarnations of God. I follow Krishna and actually Ramakrishna and Vivekananda and others, incarnations of Krishna in the 19th century in India. Others follow the Buddha and Others, hear God through the Quran and what Muhammad brought to the world, and others through Jesus. And you come from a Christian family and a Christian culture, and your morality is Christian, your orientation is Christian. Go back to America and be the best Christian you can be if you want to be a Hindu. I said, what? I said, that's your path. That's your way. That's your way up the spiritual mountain. Jesus is your incarnation. And I said, well, the Christians I grew up with wouldn't say, is your incarnation. He is the incarnation. He is God, and you have to accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior uniquely, or you're condemned to hell. And he said, well, I think Jesus was one of the incarnations, but not the only one. Am I condemned to hell? I said, I don't think so. I think, you seem like a pretty great guy. I told you I want to become a Hindu. So he said, well, figure out a way to go back to America and be an open Christian, a universally open Christian. So then I came back, same college chaplain we mentioned earlier, William Sloane Coffin, struggled with him for 2 years about how to be this kind of Christian. And ultimately he said, this doesn't really work. I mean, you really can't do this. Go check out the Unitarian Universalists, because they seem to have this attitude like you do. And you could probably be a Unitarian Universalist Christian, but from my perspective, you don't really get it about the unique divinity of Christ. So that's why I'm a Unitarian Universalist. And that's why I identify as a Christian. I'm a Christian, and only about 20% of us in Unitarian Universalism say we're Christian.
So did he himself then feel that if you did not believe in the Trinity in the traditional sense, that then you were condemned to hell?
He was a little easier on the hell stuff. So I don't think he would have quite said it that way. No, I mean, he was open to other religions and that they had their own ways.
So if you identified yourself as a Christian, though, you had to follow sort of...
Yeah, there were certain dogmatic, there were certain requirements like understanding the unique divinity of Jesus that he thought were important.
Well, and it sort of leads to this other discussion, because I'm sure you are aware of the conversations that people like Richard Dawkins or Daniel Dennett or Christopher Hitchens or Sam Harris,
a graduate of this university.
Yeah, well, yeah, he was the last, and that's what I want to talk about. So, in his book, The End of Faith, he says, if you go by the tenets of your religion, and whether that's Christianity or the Quran, Islam, that in fact you cannot be one of those individuals and have any association with other religions, because by definition you'd be an apostate, if you will, and it's not a viable conversation.
Well, he got it wrong. That's all. Sam Harris got it wrong. There's within each of the religious traditions, obviously there are people who are more dogmatic or doctrinaire in that way, but within all these traditions, there's a lot of openness as well, I think. And of course, Sam Harris was criticized himself for being a closet Buddhist and having certain ideas about consciousness and so on, capital C consciousness, that others said, well, he's not really an atheist. He has some of these odd ideas. But all of our traditions, I think, do have, within them, people who are quite open and quite rational and don't see a need to believe in some supernatural beyond what we know to be the natural world, and who understand that there's many ways to the top of the spiritual mountain.
Well, it is sort of interesting, because on the one hand, he talks about being dogmatic and defines it through some of these traditions, yet, in fact, he's one of the most dogmatic people himself, right? Which is...
I wouldn't want to call somebody a dogmatist. That would not be a liberal way of...
I couldn't do that then. No, and I enjoy the writing of those individuals and sort of some of their insights, but...
I mean, by the way, it should be said, all those books that you mentioned, do one really important, they do a lot of important things. I actually preached a sermon series at Memorial Church on what's right about atheism, and I went through 4 weeks through each of the 4 people you've just mentioned and their books and the God Delusion and so on, and said what's right. And most of what they say is right because it has to do with all of the horrible things that are done in the name of religion in the world and how badly religion acts in many cases. So the bigotry, the discrimination, the violence, the holy wars, the pogroms, the Holocaust, all in the name of religion. And they recite that at length in those books, and they're right. We should be ashamed of ourselves. And we should figure out how to reform those religious traditions so that sort of thing never happens.
Well, the challenge, of course, though, is, as you know, I mean, you look at these different, the major religions even, I mean, we have, over 40,000 sects of Christianity, over 40,000. Well, I mean, they can't even reconcile themselves, right? And
that's the problem with the Reformation. If you just had the Catholic Church, it's Catholic, it's universal, it's one church. And then these Protestants came along and they started splitting and and protesting against each other.
Yes, and it's interesting because even within the one true church, now it's splintered into multiple one true churches. So, by
the way, there was an Eastern Orthodox church. There was a split between the Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox in about 1,000 years ago, which started this.
And my view, and I throw this out, it seems as though from a historical point of view, I mean, all of these different things occur as a response to a society or culture and response to historical events associated with that, and whether that translates into ego power of individuals, that always does seem to play a role in this. It's like I always say the isms are all wonderful as long as humans are never involved, and therein lies the problem. It's our own sometimes I think lack of insight and our delusion, get into the Buddhist sort of area, and not sort of staying honest.
But I think you're right about you said earlier about meaning and purpose, and I think we're basically wired as human beings. Maybe because we're self-referential, as we were saying before, we have small c, if not capital C, consciousness. We're wired to ask these questions about meaning and purpose, and that's what religion basically has done. So maybe if we could eliminate religion from the face of the earth, that would be a good thing given all the horrible things that are done in its name. But it doesn't seem we've been very effective, notwithstanding what you said about Europe, being pretty unreligious these days, but other countries that had a long history of atheism through communism or, Maoism or whatever, as things pull back, the religions seem to come back again. So I think what we've got to do is to work to make religions humane, to make them compassionate, to make them, a lot of them have within them the seeds for social justice and social equality and so on. And their founders spoke that way, and a lot of, there's a lot to draw on there in those traditions, which was what drew me to religion in college, because who's out there doing the good work around civil rights and women's rights and early LGBT rights and fighting against an unjust war and so on? They were religious people.
Oh, absolutely. No question. It is interesting to note, though, that what we have seen historically, and you can almost track this, is that in times of instability, in times of stress, in times of lack of resources, in times of fear, that is typically when religion becomes very important in people's lives. There's of course this saying, there are no atheists in foxholes, right? I would say there's no atheists when there's turbulence on the airplane, is my but as you track wealth in a country, stability in a country, you also see a decline in religion oftentimes. And then when you see instability comes, oftentimes that comes back. And oftentimes the most fundamentalist, vociferous practitioners of these are in situations where there's profound poverty, lack of education, and strife.
Well, I think it goes both ways. I think, you look at America, I mean, I guess you could say America is maybe not the wealthiest, most powerful country in the world, but to the extent that it is, religion's alive and well in America. And it's, a lot of other places like Europe look just astounded at how religious we are in this country. So why is that? And I don't think it can be explained by saying,
Oh no, I think we are in some ways an exception to that. I'm not, and I don't know if it's the concept of sort of rugged individualism or the manner in which America has evolved. But then the question is, when you say religious, what does that really mean? There was an interesting, and I don't know if you've seen this, there was a documentary called The God Who Wasn't There. I don't know if you've seen it, and I can't recall the person who did it, but it was an individual who'd grown up in an evangelical type of fundamentalist upbringing. And he was an adult, and he questioned his whole experience, and then went back and asked very deep, penetrating questions of those who had taught him and individuals within the circle in which he grew up. And many of them were actually quite ignorant of nominally what they should know the most about, which defines their life. And in fact, he went outside of a revival, and I can't remember if it was a Billy Graham or an Oral Roberts, or one of these types of individuals, and then polled people as they came out. And there were basically 10 fundamental questions which nominally any Christian would know, and the average was 4, I think, out of the 10. I may be a little wrong here, but that's sort of a summation of the thing. And my point being, and I think his point was that while 70-some% of people may say, well, I'm a Christian and I'm religious, the fact of the matter is, though, that religiosity, I think, is extraordinarily thin veneer that on really close inspection you find out probably has several cracks. Because, I talk to people who say, well, I'm really religious. I go, well, how often do you go to church? Well, I go on Christmas and Easter. Well, can you tell me, the books of the New Testament? That they can't. And then you start querying them on different events that have occurred in the Bible, and they don't have knowledge of that. They certainly haven't studied the Bible. And in fact, when you really get into it, what it has served for them in some ways is a comforter in times of anxiety or fear, and a general sort of mechanism to give them ethics and morals and values.
Well, Stephen Prothero, who is the chair of the religion department at Boston University, has written a number of books, but one of them is looking at the issue of religious literacy and saying, you're absolutely right, it's quite pathetic how little people within not just Christianity but other traditions know about their own tradition. And so he's tried to say we need to, because religion has such an effect in so many ways, we need to know more and be more literate about religion. So that's definitely an issue. But returning to your previous point, I was with a group of Unitarian Universalist ministers some years ago who were very involved in urban ministry, in working with low-income people, working on issues of civil rights and so on in cities. And as I said, only about 20% of us in my denomination identify as Christian. And one of the people at this table, as we were talking about issues in urban ministry, said something about Christians being, this enormous part of the problem, and how could people possibly believe what Christians believe, and so on. And there was silence around the table. As I looked around at the 12 or 15 ministers, I realized this person who was doing the critique of Christianity was the only person in the room who didn't identify as a Unitarian Universalist Christian. So what happened was people in my denomination who were most involved with social justice work found Jesus to be the person that they turned to and gave them sustenance, not when they needed to be comforted, not because they were fearful, but in their social justice work. So they looked to the people I mentioned before, whether it's a Martin Luther King and a Rosa Parks or Cesar Chavez or whatever, Dolores Huerta in this area. they looked to Jesus as not as the comforter, not as the good shepherd, but as the social activist, the prophet, the person that was out there making a difference for the hungry, the imprisoned, the stranger, and so on. And I think there's a whole other dimension to religion of Christianity that's often missed in that way.
Well, I think that's interesting because in some ways you're defining either, I don't know if mentor is the right word, or someone you look to as a model or someone to model your own behavior around. And certainly you've mentioned Gandhi and Martin Luther King.
And the Dalai Lama.
And the Dalai Lama. And many of these extraordinary individuals who have put themselves out there, put themselves at great risk, and suffer the consequences many times, but not changing how they view the world, which I think is the extraordinary thing. It's interesting just to mention a scientific study. They did a study one time, and this was about the Good Samaritan. And so it took these students who were about to graduate from theological school.
Princeton Theological School.
Yeah. And so, and you may know the study better than I, but what they were doing is they were in a room, and the idea was that as part of their graduating, they had to give a sermon on the Good Samaritan. And they delayed them, and I think even put them in a position where they didn't have actually enough time to prepare. And then from going from where they were at to where the sermon was going to be was a certain distance. And what they did was they placed a person moaning on the side of, the path, a poor person, nominally a poor person who was in pain and suffering. And certainly these individuals on their way to this sermon, the vast majority did not actually stop to practice the tenets of what that sermon would be. And it shows you how sometimes in your head you may have a moral philosophy, but it is the action component of that moral philosophy that defines if in fact you're actually practicing that. And it's something I think all of us...
So can I play with that story a little bit for a moment? Because it's a study that I've used as well. And just to go a little further with it, what they did was they divided people into two groups. One were going to tell the story of the Good Samaritan to undergraduates. So these are Princeton theological students. The other half were going to give them instruction about their job search, employment possibilities. So they divided them that way. Then they did a second cut, and it's about 10 minutes to the place they were going to do this lecture, either one of these two lectures. For one group, they said, you've got 20 minutes, it's about 10 minutes away. The other group, they said, you've got 10 minutes, and it's 10 minutes away, so get going. The other group, they said, oh, we're sorry, in giving you the instruction, it's now, you're late. It's about 10-minute walk here, but you only have 5 minutes to get there. So they sent them off with this time pressure. And it turned out that the group that had 20 minutes, that more than 2/3 stopped and helped that person. So I think 68% stopped. The people that were just on time, just over 40% stopped. And the people who had only 5 minutes to get there, 20% stopped. So I carry with me this little card in my wallet all the time, which is moral risk factors in living an ethical life. And I have on this, there's a whole story behind this which I won't bore you with, but number 7 of moral risk factors in living an ethical life is time constraints. And if you're in a rush, you can make bad moral decisions. So what happened in this case was that, give credit to 2/3, if they had the time, they would stop. But if you press people on this and the 6 other factors on here, like stress and some other things, people make bad moral decisions.
But actually, before you put that away, could you read those for us? No, I think actually this is quite important.
So one of them is having an urgent personal goal. You have to get somewhere or do something, and you have to get over the top of the mountain, and you may not see who's on the way over the top of the mountain. A critical juncture. Sometimes we come up against circumstances that are out of the ordinary for us, but are these critical moments where you can see whether people make good choices or bad. But watch out for those critical junctures because you may make bad choices. If you have unexpected and unwanted events, like bloody people in your path, you can sometimes be challenged to not make a good decision. If you have negative role models, you saw the last 5 people go by and they say, well, I don't really want to be bothered, and everybody else is going by, you may go by yourself. A possible way out. It's not my job to worry about people. We have, police that do that, and we have, other people to, or maybe I'll call on my cell phone when I get there and say, there's this bloody person back there, whatever. Possible way out. Stress. You're just stressed out. And time constraints. I actually did a sermon once on 12 reasons I don't stop for homeless people. And of course, that was tongue-in-cheek because I do actually try to stop for homeless people a lot. But there's at least 12 different excuses I've given myself to not stop for homeless people, like time constraints. I would, but I'm really late to what, this is a really important thing. Or the person looks kind of dangerous. I don't know. The person is drunk. Do I really want to stop and help somebody who's, and give them money that they're just going to go get more alcohol? We're great at rationalizing. So, I can just tick through, 12 reasons I don't stop for homeless people,
Actually, I'll tell you a very quick story. I had actually, as you know, at one time gave a significant amount of money away, but one of the organizations I gave that money to actually did not use it as I had wished. And I was quite upset and angry because I had believed in what I had been told, and then the funds were diverted to some other purpose, which I had not agreed to. And so I sued this group. And my wife, who acts sometimes as an anchor in good judgment when I'm upset and angry, said, well, you've already given this money, you're going to now spend more money, which I had to pay for myself. And I said, no, there's a principle here. I will not stand for this. So I sued, and it got quite testy, and I don't know if any of you have interacted with lawyers, not legal ministry lawyers, but other lawyers. I was at a deposition, and they had their lawyers, and they were spending my money for their lawyers, actually. And I was really upset. So, and this event, this deposition stuff occurred in downtown San Jose, which isn't the nicest area. So during lunchtime, after this sort of grueling several hours of interacting in this manner, I actually walked out, and it was not a nice neighborhood, and I was walking by myself to lunch, and I went purposely by myself because I was reflecting on this situation, because now I've given this money away, now I'm spending more money. I'm sitting there going, am I just a fool who's always optimistic and think people do the right thing, and I've given this money away, and my wife told me, you shouldn't be doing this and wasting more money. And as I'm walking across the parking lot of a gas station, I feel a tap on my shoulder. And it is a Afro-American youth who, as much as we may all decide we're liberal and non-prejudicial, in fact, that is not true. And so my immediate response was to sort of jump and to sit there and do this immediate assessment, which was he's probably a drug addict who wants money from me. And I will freely tell you that that was the thought process that went through. And he says, I'm sorry to bother you. And he's dressed not particularly well. I'm sorry to bother you. My car broke down, and could you give money for my mother and I to get the bus back to our home? Now, I look around, I don't see any car, I don't see any mother, I don't see anything. I'm going, oh, this is a pretty interesting scam, and so in this microseconds of thinking through this, I went back to this discussion I was just having with myself about what an idiot I am about giving money away. And then I said, wow, he wants money, should I give him money? And should I prove I'm an idiot twice? So I proved I was an idiot twice. I reached into my wallet and gave him money. And I said, good luck to you, I wish you the best. And I walked back, and now I began the second part of my conversation, which is now, geez, I'm an even bigger idiot because I just gave this money away. So then I go, and I'm sitting in an outdoor cafe, and thinking about this and ruminating on this, and I get a tap on my shoulder. And it's this kid. And he says, I so appreciate what you did for me. I just wanted to introduce you to my mother. So there was a mother. So
it brings the mother over to...
Yeah, introduce me and to thank me personally and for giving them their bus fare home. So, on that note, I think with our 7 rules of morality and a story about how hopefully to always think the best, we can close this evening. Thank you so much, Scotty. I really appreciate it. Thank you all.
You made a fascinating comment about making religion more humane. How would you envision that happening, and how would you get those people together to do it?
How to make religion more humane. I think you've got to get together in community and remind people of what our traditions say, and work on it. I mean, it's the beauty of religion to me is unlike business, perhaps medicine, the academy, and so on. You can actually hold people accountable for what they claim these traditions are about. And at the base of all of these traditions are some claims to compassion and altruism and so on. So I think you can help people return to their roots. And so I find in my own churches and communities that you raise social justice issues, ask people to take a look, figure out how to do it in a way that engages people, and ultimately you can be held accountable in religion in a way you can't when you say, well, at least we educated you, or the military protected you, or business made a profit, or we cured your brain cancer. Am I not getting at your question?
No. You definitely are. I'm going like, okay, I could understand maybe how that would work with UU or Congregationalists or other Christian religions, but we hate the Muslims. We're afraid of the Buddhists and all of these other people. They're the other. How do we get beyond that?
Fundamentally, you have to have inclusiveness and openness and a belief that there is dignity and value in all believers, and accept that, and truly accept that. But the evolutionary construct of our humanity is that there's this deeply ingrained tribalism, and there's work to be done on that. And we actually do a compassion cultivation training that not only focuses on self-compassion, but it is, if you will, extending your circle of compassion to others, starting with yourself, those who love you, those who you're neutral to, those who you may not particularly like, and then to those who beyond. And it takes work, and I will not pretend to you that it happens overnight, but if you have the intent and it is on your mind, it makes it much easier to do that. But it's an effort. There's an interesting book that talks about, if you will, religion and its effect and its purpose in terms of an evolutionary construct called Big Gods. But it talks about this issue too of giving boundaries and this construct so that you have to have responsibility.
Personal relationships. That's my answer. Is that. And that's what we try to do here. We both work at Stanford, and we try in a very pluralistic campus to get people to truly know each other across difference. And religion is a big one, and religion's hard to talk about. A lot of students won't talk about religion. They feel it's going to blow up friendship groups. It's too difficult. So to help our Stanford students realize that they're going to be global citizens and global leaders for the 21st century with all of the discrimination and bigotry and misunderstanding between religious traditions, they better get to know who their roommate and the people they're having dinner with and going to classes with really are, because there's incredible diversity on this campus. And once you get to know that Muslim, that Jew, that Christian, that evangelical Christian, that liberal Christian, that atheist, and you really know them as people, a lot of this is very hard to continue. And so that's one of the things I try to talk about on campus.
There's an interesting story at The Hague where they have some of these prisoners who are waiting for their trials for crimes against humanity from different traditions, and now they've been in prison together for years, and they actually now play chess and interact with each other because they've been forced to be together, and there's not a whole lot of difference, obviously, that ends up they realize in between them, yet they've spent their entire lives in this incredibly divisive manner. And so...
Hi. I was just wondering, how would you answer an atheist who finds the phrase "no atheists in foxholes" highly insulting?
Well, I'm an atheist, and I don't particularly find it insulting. I find it amusing, and it was certainly said in the context of amusing. You know, obviously, if you're an atheist, you have no belief system other than the fact that there is nothing beyond what is happening right this second at the end of our lives. There's nothing beyond that, and that's perfectly okay. You know, I certainly, though, will tell you in my own instance, and I think of others, when suddenly you're faced with what appears to be a potentially terrifying or potentially death, oftentimes you suddenly take pause. And I think that's true of many people. So I certainly said that tongue-in-cheek, in no way meaning to insult my atheist brethren. So I want to get too wrapped up around that. Yes, ma'am.
Can you imagine, or have you
Get
ever?
it closer to you.
Can you imagine, or have you ever met a Unitarian who took the Bible literally?
I've never met a Unitarian who takes the Bible literally, no.
What?
I've not, no.
Yeah, I don't think you
But
could.
I mean, I'm just, my brother, who's not a Unitarian, but he came to your sermon on Easter, and you talked about Christ rising.
A resurrection.
As a metaphor, and he said, well, he's not a real Christian. But
I've heard that before, yeah.
but I mean, could a Unitarian actually, do you think, believe the Bible literally? I mean,
If you mean,
theoretically. But
are there Unitarian Universalists out in America or around the world who think that Jesus bodily rose from the dead? You could take a picture photographically. I think virtually no Unitarian Universalist would believe that, no.
That's not a dogma then. You don't, I mean.
That's a dogmatic statement?
But by a Unitarian dogma that you couldn't accept, I mean, maybe in some other dimension or something like that, I don't know how people that do take the Bible literally, and they also believe in science, how they can bring the two together.
I'm not sure if they can believe in science, but I think we're heading off into a debate that maybe we don't have a great deal of time, and it may not be the appropriate venue for that. So.
Well, anyway, it was just something that because of that.
But I think you raise an interesting point to me, which is the intolerance of people who say they're tolerant. So I claim to be a liberal, I claim to be tolerant and so on, but don't I sound dogmatic when I appear to be intolerant of certain views? And I think that's a legitimate criticism. And I think for me, I try to keep 5 or 10% of my being open to being wrong. I mean, maybe Jesus did, bodily arise from the dead, and, someday we'll figure out how scientifically that can happen.
Yes, ma'am.
Transitions, even when they're chosen, are often or frequently complicated. And I'm curious about where you are on that journey in your transition and what you're struggling with.
So, my own transition, yes, I'm leaving this position as Dean for Religious Life. I'm leaving being a university chaplain after 30 years of that. I'm retiring. I actually will be coming back to teach at the business school, teach business ethics on a part-time basis, so I'm not entirely retiring. But you're right, it's a big transition time. For me, it's an exciting time in many ways because, like an adolescent who says, what am I going to do when I grow up? I get that chance again to say, what am I going to do in my next career? But on the other side, I think this particular transition is one where I'd like to have some dimension of walking into an open field and saying, what's there that I might not know about or hear or see or whatever. So that's one thing I want to try and have a discipline of not presuming what might lie out there. And how can I do that? I think I'm afraid it's faith. It's just a sense that if you can open yourself to, I'll use some theological language here, to the grace of God, that you may be filled with a Holy Spirit of something that I can't see or know now, and have some new vision of how to serve.
I wanted to hear more about your personally transformative teachers. So you talked about mentors such as Gandhi or Martin Luther King, but people in how you sought people at Stanford or at Tufts or in India that transformed your life, how you found them, and then how you engaged with them. Was it more formal or was it more informal? So a couple.
Well, I can tell you from my own experience, and I have a slightly different story. I grew up in poverty. My father was an alcoholic. My mother was an invalid. My family was on public assistance. Neither went to college. So that gives a different situation somewhat. But that being said, to some extent I was always self-aware. And one of the greatest blessings I had actually was a person who I actually met at a magic shop, and I've told this story, and some of you may have heard it. I went into this magic shop as a 13-year-old curious about magic. But the owner was not there, but his mother was there, and she was, if you will, and we're talking about the 60s, she was one of these 60s Earth Mother types, if you can think about, sort of this ebullient woman wearing this flowery dress and this long hair and braids. And she began talking to me, and at the end of this brief conversation, she said to me, I really like you. If you come in, I'm here for the rest of the summer for the next 6 weeks. If you come in and spend some time with me every day, I'll teach you something that I think could change your life. And that woman went out of her way, actually, and I met with her every day, to teach me a meditation, mindfulness practice combined, if you will, with the power of positive thinking and a different way to look at the world. And for me personally, it took me from a position of a perception of limited to no possibilities to potentially one of unlimited possibilities. And fundamentally, it changed how my brain looked at the world and my position in the world. And it actually gave me a tool set, actually, that allowed me to be here today, but it also led me on a path of inquiry into meaning and purpose, and then allowed me to start looking at a variety of different teachers and many of them spiritual leaders. And it's certainly interesting how that path, though, ultimately led me to be an atheist, but at the fundamental core of it, for me personally, a belief that meaning is wrapped up in service to others and with intent caring about others. Unfortunately, I think we are out of time, and I apologize. I know sometimes there are wonderful questions out there, but we are limited by time. So thank you all so much. Certainly, if you do have a question, I'm sure Scotty or I would be happy to answer if you want to drop us an email. And again, thank you so much for coming and supporting what we do. Thank you. Really a pleasure.
It was great. Thank you very much.